Hey guys, this is Allison from Allykatkreations. How are you? Please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. If you get anything from my work, a connected dot, an epiphany, a mind blown moment, a mushroom cloud moment, a new book to read, a new author to explore, please consider supporting my work. All the links will be at the bottom of the video in the description box. The truth about evolution and the Bible. Because these authors are amazing. And I made a correlation yesterday in the video of Blavatsky that Manly P. Hall, Blavatsky, and the Curtises, who wrote this truth about evolution and the Bible, their work all meshes together. It's really interesting. Quite interesting, in fact. Because I'm drawing the correlation between the Arantia book, the Olaspe book, the Keys of Enoch, Ashiana Dean's work, the Voyagers books. She has a lot of other books. The Law of One, and some Hermetic work, or corresponding with those books. And a book I'm reading right now, by Manly P. Hall, really dives into the other book that I read, The Realms of the Living Dead. There's a lot of parallels. So I like how a lot of these books and a lot of these authors they bounce off of Blavatsky a lot because they quote her extensively. So we're going to pick up on the chapter 9, the Garden of Eden. This should be very interesting because Adam and Eve was whoo. Quote, and the Lord planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. End quote. Genesis 8-9. Quote, the student of occultism has to bear in mind that every god and hero in ancient pantheons, that of the Bible included, has 3 biographies in the narrative, so to say, running parallel with each other, and each connected with one of the aspects of the hero, historical, astronomical, and perfectly mythical, the last serving to connect the other 2 together and to smooth away the asperities and discordances of the first 2. End quote. The secret doctrine of Blavatsky. Genius. Probably in no other chapters of the Bible is the manifest absurdity of the words, when taken in their literal materialistic sense, so evident as in the first 4 chapters of Genesis. It is imaginatively possible to conceive of a God taking a handful of clay and modeling an image of man, animating it, and later on marshaling the more than 1 million species of living things, including 3,500 species of mammals, 3,500 species of reptiles, 400,000 species of insects, etc. In a long line which would reach across 4 states from New York to Washington, D.C., and parading them before the newly animated mannequin, that he might name them But to accomplish this, God would have to keep them all in line, prevent their fighting or straying, supply them with their specific foods, and keep them stepping forward at the rate of each 1 minute of the day for nearly 4 years, supposing that Adam could inspect, understand, and correctly name a new species each minute for 12 hours a day without stopping for meals or to rest his voice. For at that time he was alone among all the animals and had no Eve to bring him food. During this 4 years, all the larger animals would have brought forth several generations of progeny, while the lower forms, many of which have life cycle of only a few hours or days, would have reproduced in countless swarming millions. The absurdity of literal interpretation is too obvious to merit discussion. Even if we, I'm sorry, guys, it's really good. Even if we grant the possibility of so great a miracle, it is a little too much for the literalists to ask us to believe in a serpent that can talk, a tree that confers immortal life, and another tree that can teach man the knowledge of good and evil, all of which is quite as allegorical and fabulous as any mythology or so-called heathen scripture asks us to accept. According to St. Augustine, one of the 4 great authorities and leaders among the early church fathers, and the one who largely formulated and gave the Christian doctrines their traditional trend, says, quote, "There is no way of preserving the literal sense of the first chapters of Genesis without impiety and attributing things to God unworthy of him," end quote. It should therefore be fairly obvious that the Bible is purposely written in symbolic and allegorical language, so absurd in its literal sense as to force mankind to seek some other interpretation. As St. Paul tells us, quote, "The letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life," end quote. It is just this spiritual interpretation which we endeavor to present in this and other volumes of the Curtis books, as we have pointed out to be efficient in life's day at school. A philosophy should be sought which is so all-inclusive that it explains where it came from, why we are here, what the destiny is to which we are expected to reach, and what our individual place is in the whole mighty scheme of the universe, and how we are to obtain it. The essentials of this cosmic spiritual philosophy have been known to the illumined seers, adepts, wise men, and initiates into the mysteries in all ages, but have been withheld from profane who cannot understand them without the special training that is given to a candidate for the mysteries. As St. Augustine plainly tells us, quote, "What is now called the Christian religion has existed among the ancients and was not absent from the beginning of the human race until Christ came in the flesh, from which time true religion, which already existed, began to be called Christian," end quote. The locality of the Garden of Eden has been vainly sought, not only by Christian theologians, but also by religionists of all creeds, from the days of the early Indian Aryans to the present day, for the story of a garden as the birthplace of humanity is by no means confined to the Christian scriptures. The Hindu legend of such an Elysium or paradise is still more striking. Quote, "In the sacred mountain Meru, which is perpetually clothed in the golden rays of the sun, and whose lofty summit reaches into heaven, no sinful man can exist. It is guarded by a dreadful dragon. It is adorned with many celestial plants and trees, and is watered by 4 rivers, which separate and flow to the 4 chief directions. Among the Hindus, the garden is located near the lake of the dragon, in the plateau of Pamir, from which region go forth the four rivers, Osus, Indus, Ganges, and Silo. Among the Greeks, there were also four symbolic rivers, but these were represented as being in the nether world, or the plane of physical embodiment, namely the Pelagathon, Cactus, Styx, and Archeron, something like that, whose symbology we have described elsewhere. Cuneiform inscriptions have also been found, which show conclusively that the Babylonians had this legend 15,000 years before the Hebrews. Of this legend of a garden, we are told, quote, "It was born in the mysterious locality which no one is able to locate, in which is the despair of both the geographers and Christian theologians," end quote. Therefore, let us try to grasp the main lesson, which has most ancient and universal myth out pictures, and deduce from the Bible narrative of it some logical sequence and helpful application. The statement that the garden was placed eastward in Eden is significant. On a rotating globe, there can be no spot that is actually only relatively east or west. It's true. A particular spot can be east or west only from some point arbitrarily chosen according to a conventional division of the Earth's surface. Even today, to the people of the Far East, America lies east of them, although it is called the Western world. Placing the garden eastward in Eden does not locate it in the least, and hence no such spot has ever been found. The Encyclopedia Britannica tells us that research into primitive beliefs, guided by the comparative method, leads to the view that the garden was originally a celestial, superphysical locality. The geographical details given in the Bible are rather difficult to work into a consistent picture. As a matter of fact, it was purposely intended that no such spot was ever to be located and found literally and physically, for the entire narrative is symbolic. The supposed location varies which each racial story of creation, Babylon, Chaldean, Mayan, Incan, etc. Therefore, we may well exclaim with Origen, one of the greatest authorities among the fathers of the early Christian church, quote, "What man is found such an idiot as to suppose that God planted trees in paradise in Eden like a husbandman," end quote. Since the spiritual man was created in the higher superphysical worlds, like every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, the Eden in which this man was placed symbolizes the superphysical, etherical globe, which was condensing from radiant matter through the stage of fire mist into a physical or dense material earth. Eden also symbolizes the state of innocence and spiritual consciousness, which the soul enjoyed before it was embodied in matter. A man cannot return to or re-enter this Eden until he has mastered matter, learned to rule his garden, and has so purified and spiritualized the body through which he manifests that it can vibrate to the high octave of Edenic conditions. This is the goal of all his evolution through matter. The bare statement about the formation of man is first elaborated as a mystical allegory. We are told that the first Eden is formed, and then within it a garden is fashioned, and in the garden is placed the man, or more correctly, the living soul. What is more reasonable than to understand that this garden made of the dust of earth and planted and watered, fitted in every way as a dwelling place for the living soul, who had come to incarnate on the earth through the divine breath, was this same body of man referred to in the previous verse, man's semi-astral or etherealized body, that newly individualized portion or garden. It was a concrete, individualized portion of a newly created globe of universal primordial substance, or fire mist, which, through cosmic involution, had taken on the form of a new planet, Earth, here called Eden. Since the east is the point where the sun rises to give light, life, and warmth to the physical world, it is used in the symbolical allegorical writings in all languages to symbolize the point of origin of all things, the super or pre-physical, the spirit. Therefore, when man's body, the garden, began to manifest physically on earth out of the previously invisible etherical state, since man's destiny is to be the light bearer and ruler of the globe, it was quite correct to describe it as appearing eastward in Eden, just as the sun appears in the east out of the mist of night to illume and rule the day. As we have already pointed out in Genesis, we find four mystical rivers represented as watering the Garden of Eden: Pison, Gihon, Hiddekel, and Euphrates. Taking Eden as a symbolic reference to the body of man, these four rivers correspond to the four great arteries proceeding from the heart, which carry the purified blood to the four regions of the body indicated. The first river, Pison, whose meaning is joined together as one, which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, refers to the inanimate artery which is formed by the right subclavian and the right common choroid arteries. Joined as one, the meaning of the word Havilah is to bring forth, to form, create, to supply, strength, all of which vividly portrays the offices of the brain and right arm and head, which are supplied by the river of blood. The river Gihon, signifying to run out, to burst forth into thought, refers to the left common choroid artery, and supplies the left side of the brain and head. The third river, Hiddekel, something like that, meaning free-flowing, refers to the left subclavian artery, which supplies the left arm. The fourth river, Euphrates, means to increase the creative power. The fruitful river symbolizes the descending aorta, the great river of blood that supplies the lungs and entire body below the diaphragm, including the creative centers. Thus, the four rivers water the whole garden. With the basic conception in mind, it is easy to discern the meaning of the seemingly ridiculous incident of the animals being brought to Adam to be named. For since the body of man is the result of the evolution of all lower kingdoms, every child that is born inherits not only all the functions developed by the animal kingdom, but also embodies the cream of all the experiences passed through during all previous stages of evolution. As the physical body or material manifestation of the earth was involved long before the body of man appeared upon it, so was the body of man involved long before his soul descended and appeared within it. And since his body was formed of earth materials, it is necessarily has within it all the development that the earth particles have obtained. Man's body therefore contains the synthesized essence of all the instincts, tendencies, and potentialities of all the lower kingdoms, the vegetable, the animal, the birds, and every creeping thing. These are all transmuted into faculties, functions, powers, and instinctive reactions of body and mind, as evidenced by the stages through which the body passes before birth. Not only do we inherit the potentialities of lower kingdoms, but we embody many of the actual atoms that compose their bodies. This is evidenced by the fact that man's body is formed of the dust of the ground. And of what is that dust composed? Through countless ages, all prehistoric forms of life had to have their evolution and leave their remains behind. Through still greater ages, these remains had to be consolidated in the sedimentary rocks, oil, shale, Then, as the sedimentary rocks disintegrated into dust in succeeding ages, they released the very atoms that compose the bodies of all the prehistoric forms of life, from the tiny trilobite to the 100-foot Allantosaurus, the giant, I'm going to butcher these, these dinosaurs. Just leave it at dinosaurs. Even of the man today, it is said, dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. The dust also contains the remains of all the later forms of life that have ever manifested on earth, many of the same atoms of which are built into man's body. For from the soil they are built into the plants, grains, fruits, and animals, which man uses for food, and so become a part of his body, as they became a part of the bodies of many previously forms of life. And since every atom bears a radioactive imprint of every dynamic form of life with which it has been intimately associated, our bodies not only inherit the functions and instincts of the lower kingdom, but actually possesses the same atoms and radioactive emanations. In fact, we have within us every element that has entered into formation and evolution of the planet, and all that ever dwelt thereon. Get out of this dust of the ages, which contained all the imperfections of earlier stages and all the impurities of the earlier forms. Out of all this, refuse the Lord God saw fit to evolve a body which the spiritual man would have to use as his instrument through which to manifest on earth, in which he must ultimately so purify and perfect as to enable him to become the Lord of creation and the ruler of the garden. This conception also gives the key to that other similar miracle of Noah, gathering two of every kind of beast, bird, and reptile into the ark. For in one sense, the ark symbolizes the human fetus floating in the amniotic waters, while it repeats or embodies all the animals or the lower stages of evolution. If it would have taken Adam nearly 4 years merely to name the different species when already gathered and brought to him, how long would it have taken Noah to roam the earth after the rains had begun and many parts were already underwater, and capture, feed, and transport to the ark two of every kind of bird, reptile, and animal? It is evident that the symbolic interpretation is the only one possible. As we have previously explained, to interpret through the science of logography, the story of the naming of the animals means that man must take all the materials and animal forces to be found in his body, recognize the good they can accomplish for him, and gather up their true essence of life and build it into his higher soul life. Herein lies one of the greatest mysteries of life, for not only is man given dominion over all these kingdoms, but he assumes his dominion only as he names, recognizes, controls, and gives them their true place in the garden, or uplifts them in his own organism. The incident of naming the animals gives marvelous proof of the power and place of intuition, tuition from within, or the ability of properly trained seers to receive revelations from superior beings. For at the time the Bible was compiled, there were no written records as to what took place in Eden thousands of years before, nor was there any physical science or even any science instruments for the investigation of nature. Hence, there were no paleontological or anthropological data from which to deduce a theory of evolution, yet the general outline of the entire scheme was so fully grasped and clearly understood that the whole process was marvelously and correctly expressed in that one pageant verse in Genesis. Although man is the crowning point of evolution, he is still more or less affected by all the lower forces which he embodies, and he must learn to master and control them, or he can become the Lord of creation. As for as long as he allows the inherent characteristics of the minerals and chemical activities of earth, the gases of the air, the herbs of the field, the traits, powers, and instincts of the beasts, the birds, and the creeping things To sway him, he is still the slave of physical conditions. Because of this, there is a certain amount of truth in the theories of determinism and behavioralism. But if even one man ever surmounted the handicaps his hereditary and environment placed upon him, he has proven that the determinism is not a compelling law. That while heredity and environment had noticeable influence on his career, they are nevertheless only minor factors. The major and essential factor is the degree of advancement of the incarnating soul, for its degree of unfoldment will manifest no matter what the heredity and environment. The fact that poor and uneducated boys of obscure parents overcome all obstacles of heredity and environment and rise to be presidents of the banks, railroads, steel trusts, while their brothers and sisters born under exactly the same conditions do not rise out of their environment of influences, plainly shows that it is the inherent quality of the soul that is a determining factor and not heredity and environment. Abraham Lincoln was born with the heredity and in an environment of the rail splitter, and 99 out of 100 of the others in the environment remained rail splitters because they were not advanced souls. But Lincoln was an advanced soul, and he demonstrated his greatness of soul by overcoming all handicaps and expressing the degree of his spiritual advance in spite of all the deterministic factors. Once we recognize that we are more than mere human animals, reacting to the conditions in our environment and to our inbred animal instincts, that we have within us all the powers and potencies of the living soul, the spiritual man, with which to rule our garden. We need no longer to be subject to the rule of the lower vibrations, but are capable of ruling over them in love and wisdom. The soul comes down from the higher worlds pure and perfect, and is given in its garden in which to dwell. God made this garden perfect and filled it with all the needful trees and fruits. But through many incarnations, man has only often scattered the seeds of weeds in his garden, many of which proven poisonous. He also planted trees of whose bitter fruit he must eat until he learns that they should have no place in his garden. The Lord God instructed man to tend and cultivate his garden, perfect its fruits, and rule over the inhabitants and manifestations. And man must reincarnate again and again until he has accomplished his mission and take his place as the Lord of creation. Once this new idea is recognized by the mind according to the laws of mind, there is a modification of mind in conformity with the idea. And if the idea is held continually, or reoccurred too frequently and positively, it grows and grows and reacts upon the body with greater and greater power until finally the body is modified in conformity with the new idea, just as it was the mind. This is true of the birth of every new conception in proportion to the power we give it. We must therefore seriously face ourselves and cease our opposition to the manifestation of divine in us. Must learn what our real self is and what influences come from it and what from the lower personal self. It is this struggle for manifestation of the image projected from the consciousness of God when we were sent forth on our cycle of evolution that is destined to unfold the perfect pattern and fill a certain place in the grand plan. Once this is realized, then will all these subjects of ours be brought to our attention by the Lord, law, as they are presented as being brought to Adam, to be recognized and named and served us and worshiped at our feet as Lord of the garden. The body then is the garden given each incarnated soul to cultivate and rule. It is filled with all kinds of plants, vegetable functions, and trees, nerve trunks, and their forces also fruits of the spirit, both pleasant to the sight and good for food, which the living soul must tend, cultivate, and ultimately bring to perfection. It is also swarming with every fowl of the air, thoughts and ideas, every beast of the field, appetites, passions, and desires, which the Lord law brings to the attention of the man to be recognized as being within and a part of himself, and to be named, controlled, and trained to follow the law, the man can re-enter and ultimately become the ruler of Eden as a Lord of creation. Mic drop. That was a mic drop. The trees in the garden. Quote, out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Genesis. Quote, what man is found such an idiot as to suppose that God planted trees in paradise in Eden like a husbandman? And quote, Mystery of Adonai, St. Augustine. In the previous chapters, we have seen that Eden embraced far more than merely a garden, for Eden was the entire newly created ethereal globe in which all things were still in the perfection of their astral patterns. Quote, every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. End quote. As yet unmodified, limited, or distorted by embodiment in the densest state of physical matter, the tiny garden was man's etherealized and as yet pure body in which the real or androgynous man dwelt before the sexes separated, and he became truly terrene. Sorry, guys, my allergies are absolutely asinine. Each soul incarnating on this planet has given to it, as the materials for the dwelling place, just such a garden or as much of the physical substance of the planet as is necessary for its formation and maintenance. Since man is the crowning creation or the ultimate evolution on this globe, he must ultimately become its ruler. According to one authority, the Hebrew word translated garden comes from a root word which means enveloped as with a mantle. This root meaning is found not only in the Hebrew, but the Sanskrit and Egyptian. It has no reference to a physical place or garden, but refers to spiritual man, enveloped in astral or semi-physical matter. The consciousness of the human animal in which the soul is now enveloped responds more readily to the vibrations from its animal and nature and to the vibrations from the physical world, which comes thronging into it through the avenues of five senses. And these vibrations naturally tend to awaken desires for things from which they come. The enveloping of the soul as a crude material body greatly lessens its response to spiritual vibration and brings to listen more to the call of the flesh than to the inner voice of the Lord God, which speaks within the garden. In other words, it brings to be ruled by the outer vibrations instead of by the vibrations from the real or spiritual man. Thus do the bodily senses seduce men to transgress the law, results of which eventuate in his expulsion from the garden. Well, in the tree of this interpretation, we see that the tree of life in the midst of the garden, in the spinal cord, whose sap is referred to later as the river of life. At the present stage of evolution, only the physiological and the beginning of its psychological functions of the marvelous tree are developed in the average man, but it contains mystical and spiritual centers, which are more or less dormant as yet, like the tightly rolled buds of a rose. Yet this mysterious tree can bear good fruit only when it has reached a mature stage of evolution. Its fruit can ripen normally only in the light of the spiritual sun, and not in the reflected light of the astral world, where there are so many deceptive lights and fearsome shadows. So many misleading and evil forces, ever ready to blight the fruit in the bud or cause perverted and abnormal development. Through the ultimate development of this tree and its fruit in some far distant stage of evolution, the body of man will acquire much higher functions and powers, and as a result, it will become so spiritualized and responsive to the radioactivity of the indwelling spiritual man that he will evolve above the present state of human kingdom into the superhuman kingdom by the acquisition and utilization of those spiritual powers, just as he has evolved out of the animal kingdom into human or super animal kingdom by the acquisition and utilization of the added powers of a living soul. What will eventually result when this mystical tree of immortal life, mentioned in the first chapters of the Bible, is partaken of, is repeatedly set forth in the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. In Genesis, we are told the tree of life is in the midst of the garden before the sexes were separated. While in Revelation, the picture of the perfected attainment of the separated sexes is represented as a tree of life on either side of the river, which yielded her fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. In fact, all that transpires between the first chapters and the last may be interpreted as a grand allegory of the path of attainment, which the soul has to tread from the time of its first incarnation in a human animal body until it completes its cycle of necessity and reaches at one-ment with the Father in the holy city of the New Jerusalem in the super-physical worlds. Then the river of life shall flow out of the throne of God, that is it shall no longer be a current of physical life force, but of spiritual life force flowing from this spiritual man into all his bodies. With this basic conception in mind, we can see how historic personages, places, and events have been woven into the story, often quite out of their actual setting, to illustrate the truths intended. The many unjustified wars, seizures of property, and expulsions of whole nations from their homelands, the cruelties and injustices apparently not only sanctioned, but commanded by Jehovah, but intended to illustrate the conquering, subjugating, or expelling of the lower traits, passions, and desires of the animal man, that the Lord God might reign. When this is realized, much of the sting is taken out of many otherwise unanswerable modern historical criticisms. If all such events are taken literally, we cannot blame sincere scholars whose sense of justice and humanity is outraged by the apparent sanction of such things, for exclaiming, Yahweh was a strange God, a God of battles, a God of torture, a God unwilling to forgive his erring creatures without an oblation of blood. He convened with his favorites at trickery, thieving, and murder. He pursued those he disliked with relentless hatred. He avowed himself a just God and dispensed injustice. He preached love and stirred up hatred, all of which is undeniable in the face of literal interpretation. The writer simply does not understand that the Bible must be spiritually discerned and not literally interpreted. For all the terrible things he complains of becoming an entire justifiable as an allegory of the struggles of a soul to manifest the image of God amidst the warring instincts of the flesh. But there is another tree in the midst of the garden, which grows from the roots of the tree of life. The fruit of this second tree, the Orthodox translation tells us, man was warned not to eat lest he die. This was the tree of knowledge. Knowledge of what? Since man already possessed the knowledge of the spiritual world, this new knowledge against which he was warned must have been knowledge concerning the new world into which he was destined to descend. The world of materiality ruled by the law of duality. The world in which would be found all the pairs of opposites, good and evil. And since the tree of immortal life represents the immortal ray of the divine monad, it can be approached in consciousness only by eating of the tree of knowledge by which alone intelligence and discrimination can be developed. Even through this involves partaking of the bitter fruit of personal experience, pain, suffering, and disappointment. Man's spiritual parents warned him that as he partook of the fruit of this tree or gained a knowledge of materiality, he would become so enmeshed in matter and the limitations it would impose on the spirit that he would surely die to the consciousness of the spiritual world, just as our consciousness today dies or ceases to react to the spiritual world as we are born into the physical world. For ere the soul can reincarnate on earth, it must drink of the cup of lethe, the cup of forgetfulness, and forget its heavenly home as it once more takes up its unfinished tasks, learns its new lessons, and unfolds new powers in the physical world. But the initiator or serpent of wisdom told man that he would not surely or completely die to the higher knowledge, but that ultimately his spiritual eyes would be open to both the spiritual and the material world, and thus become as gods, knowing both extremes, for he must know both the spiritual and material, the unlimited and the limited, the good and the limitation of good, or relatively evil, he can become the Lord of creation and properly tend and rule his garden. One aspect of the tree of knowledge, or good and evil, is the lower human mind of the personality of intellect. Its product or fruit is composed of the vibrations from the outer physical world coming into it through the five physical senses and producing or giving rise to or recognizing and responding to the sensations, appetites, and desires of the animal body, and often engendering in the more advanced self-aggrandizement and pride of intellect. To be ruled by these vibrations instead of by the vibrations from the real or spiritual man brings about transgressions of the law which eventuate in death. For the man, Adam, is born an image of clay into which the Lord God breathes the breath of life, but not of intellect and discrimination, which are developed only after he had tasted of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. In other words, when he has acquired the first development of mind, whose terrestrial aspect is of the earth, earthly, although its highest faculties connect with the spirit and the divine soul. While the earliest type of man, who had only just become self-conscious, could not become intellectually discriminating until after he had eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Through experience in the conditions of material embodiment, he should have done so under the guidance of the incarnating soul and not through the guidance of the animal desires. According to the Hebrew scholar already quoted, the Hebrew word translated tree, it's, really means growth, growing, or growth toward obtainment. The fruit of this growth is represented in the Bible story as a knowledge of good and evil. But the word translated knowledge, dath, also means knowing. The word for good, tab, also means cheer and joy, while the word translated evil is the Egyptian root ra, meaning the life giver. Therefore, the real meaning of the sentence is growth in knowledge of the life giver, or the life-giving power. What is this life-giving or creative power of which Adam and Eve were told not to eat lest they die? As we have already explained, according to the same symbology, this tree, which is in the midst of the garden, is a spinal cord, the sap of which is the Kundalini force, serpent force, a dynamic creative power functioning through the spinal cord, its lower aspects of creativeness being expressed through the sex organs, and its higher aspect ultimately functioning through the pineal gland. The fruit of this tree is a spiritual power gained as a result of the opening of that which is known as a third eye. As man, through experience, gains wisdom, he uses this mystical power gradually to bring about its higher physical manifestations, as well as the psychic and spiritual. When normally awakened as a result of spiritual growth, it slowly ascends the spinal cord through the central canal until it reaches and stimulates into activity the pineal gland, the conscious functioning of which is called the opening of the eye of wisdom, through which the disciple is able to see the glory of the Lord surrounding him. This is a physical effect which accompanies spiritual illumination. Since the unfoldment of the spiritual bud and the conscious use and control of his spirituality, creative power is one of the ultimate attainments of that higher evolution, which will enable man to become Superman. At their present stage of evolution, it remains dormant in the masses of mankind. Man cannot become Superman until he has reached an advanced stage of spiritual development and the buds of his 7 sacred centers have begun to unfold normally and enable him to contact and use the higher octaves of spiritual force so necessary to evolve his body to the point where he can enter the superhuman kingdom, his ultimate destiny. But before he can reach this point, man must learn to rule the animal desires and instincts and unfold the buds of higher spiritual as well as intellectual powers. For although one may be walking encyclopedia of facts, other man's ideas, he cannot be considered truly intellectual until he has used his intellect to lead him upward to the next higher realm, that of the spiritual consciousness and realization of the divine, both in the cosmos and within himself. Because of the great and terrible dangers which could result from the premature development or misuse of the powers of the mystic centers, primitive man was warned by his divine instructors not to attempt to arouse or misuse the forces of these centers, lest he surely die. For the consciousness of the undeveloped and spiritually unawakened, hence far more animal than spiritual, early races naturally responded more strongly to the denser currents of force from the outer world than to the finer currents from the spiritual world. In gratifying their animal appetites, they stimulated the lower creative centers far more than an ordinary animal would during normal procreation, for the animal is guided and controlled by instinct, while man has free will and is restrained from over self-indulgence only by influence of indwelling spiritual man, whose presence takes the place of instinct as the governing power. In other words, the early animal man failed to discriminate in the use of his newly acquired self-consciousness and his physical senses. He therefore responded to the densest and most material aspects of the desires in which he found himself enveloped. These desires tempted him from following the law, that is the law that when instinct is superseded by self-consciousness, all the creative power must be guided and controlled by the higher consciousness of the spiritual or higher self, instead of by the lower sense consciousness of the animal in which the higher self is incarnated. Since the human personality, the body, plus a much of the divine consciousness, as has been able to find, even reflected, if not directed expression, contains the divine spark, man inherits all the attributes and powers, at least potentially, of God his Father, one of the chief of which is the power to create at will, as well as procreate as do the animals. It should be clearly understood that whenever used, the sex force is always creative. As we have already shown, all forms of creation take place in subjugative worlds, spiritual, mental, or astral, even to the creation of sonata, a play, a painting, a house, or an automobile, and only later is the invisible creation or mental and astral pattern materialized or evolved on earth through the brain and hands of man, or in the case of nature, guided by the creative hierarchies working through the elementals and nature spirits. But since the divine ideation creates only in harmony, beauty, and perfection, it is the rebellious human personality refusing to obey its divine guidance and to work in harmony with the divine law and misusing its creative powers and the materials given it with which to evolve a perfect organism and environment for the use of its divine consciousness, that has created every form of inharmony, sin, and disease, war, famine, pestilence, and other disasters from which both the plant and man suffer. In fact, it is the sum total of these inharmonious worlds which constitutes what is known as hell and its devils. No wonder when, in the Dark Ages, when superstition flourished on ignorance of nature's laws, the hell and the devils and harmonies in man, which created it and kept it alive, was believed to be an eternal punishment for man. Yet already humanity is rapidly outgrowing the belief, because the divine light of our spiritual consciousness is shining more and more deeply into the hells we have created, in order to illumine them and show us what they really are, and also to help us redeem them through the radioactive power of the divine light. This is good ultimately brought out of evil, not because all is good and there is good and evil, but because the divine law strives to bring the best possible results out of our mistakes and evil creations. This is why all souls who have evolved to the state where they must begin this redemptive process, either consciously or unconsciously, must descend into the hells of their creation, either through sickness, great sorrow, disaster, or suffering of some kind, that through the strength and power of the Christ force within, with which they meet these conditions and tests, they may conquer and prove their ability to take the still higher steps of the path of attainment. If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. Even there shall thy hand lead me, and the right hand shall hold me. Yeah, the darkness hideth not from thee. The darkness and the light are both alike to thee. By man came sin and death into the world, and by man also must come the redemption. Only thus can hell be redeemed and its forces transmuted for the individual and for the world. So clearly does nature teach this lesson of redemption and bringing of good out of evil, that once it is pointed out to him, no thinking person can believe in eternal punishment or the supremacy of evil. For generations, theologians have reasoned from the false premise that because God is omnipotent, therefore he must have created all things. As a matter of fact, although God is omnipotent, he did not create all things. But since we cannot conceive of God creating in harmony evil, sin, death, and disease, it is not necessary to assassinate our reason and disregard the evidence of all our existence and our experience in life by denying their existence, although this is an unwarranted conclusion to which certain mental science cults jump. All we need to do is recognize that there are two creators, a greater and a lesser God and his offspring. Man, who was created in his image after his likeness, and who contains all his God powers, including that of creating at will according to the thought held and with, although now but an apprentice, is destined someday to create even as his father. Therefore, it was not by legitimate use of his procreative power, but by the prostitution and perversion of all his creative powers, both mind and body, and misuse of the materials given him to fashion into the garden of peace, purity, and harmony, that man can such in harmony and impurity that he not only brought evil, sin, sickness, and death upon himself, but also polluted the whole aura of Eden and cursed the very ground on which he walks. It should be noted that the ground was not cursed by God, for we cannot imagine a God of love and justice or any divine being cursing anything, but was cursed by the inharmonious, impure, and perverted creations engendered, and still being engendered by man himself. Even today, virulent diseases arise spontaneously and endemically in regions where they never occurred before and to which no source of infection can be traced, because the germs in the polluted astral world are precipitated into physical expression by the law of manifestation already explained. Throughout the past long cycles of evolution, the hosts of evil fashioned by man's thoughts and vitalized by his creative forces have battled with the hosts of good, and this conflict has found its physical expression through many great wars, great epidemics, great catastrophes, and cataclysms. But since all these results of man in harmonious creation have not fully taught him his lesson, the accumulated evil still left unredeemed by his sacrifice and suffering is yet to be faced and overcome in the great battle of Armageddon, now being fought in the mental and astral worlds with thoughts and creative forces as weapons. And the results of this struggle between the ignorance, intolerance, hatred, and impurity of mankind and his constructive and godlike thoughts and creations, due to his response to the divine consciousness through thoughts of love, devotion, aspiration, and unselfishness, must be precipitated upon the physical plane from which they arose and upon which they must find their final adjustment. Thank God that all man's thoughts and creations have not been evil, that one constructive, positive thought of good and helpfulness can neutralize and redeem many evil and destructive thoughts, that thousands upon thousands have sent out thoughts and prayers and have created plans for the betterment of mankind, so that the situation is far from being as hopeless as it looks. In fact, is distinctly encouraging, for every good thought is inspired by the divine side of man's consciousness, hence contains a higher creative potency and power, also is more enduring, although finer and more subtle, and hence more difficult of manifestation in dense earth conditions. Moreover, every constructive and helpful thought, even if seemingly lost or smothered out by the hosts of evil, is gathered up and preserved and used by the warrior angels as ammunition in the battle of Armageddon. As we have said elsewhere, the banishment of Adam and Eve from Eden was due to the fact that they could not face the flaming sword of purity, which turned every way and barred them from obtaining the fruit of the tree of life. This banishment meant that man could no longer dwell in the etherealized body garden with his spiritual faculties freely functioning as and able to talk face to face with God. This was not an instantaneous punishment, but took place through the gradual separation of man's consciousness from that of the higher self, owing to man's greater materialization and his greater response to sensations from the outer world. This gradual disuse of the function led to atrophy of the organ of direct spiritual cognition, the pineal gland, whose reawakening and renewed functioning man must regain his by conscious effort through spiritual aspiration, prayer, and endeavoring to let his life be governed by intuition and divine law. Therefore, the true soul or real self cannot fully dwell in the body of man as he is today, but can only project a ray of itself and endeavor to guide the human personality into the path of attainment and inspire him to seek the final at-one-ment. While it was destiny of both the globe and the incarnating soul to manifest in the dense material conditions of our earth, the vehicle or body built up of the physical material should have been kept so pure and sensitive that the divine self could have continued to dwell therein, instead of merely overshadowing it and incarnating only a ray as at present. Only when the body is so purified that it can truly incarnate the soul consciousness can we say with Jesus, quote, I and my Father are one, end quote. I wouldn't be surprised if there's like my guardians upstairs directing me somehow, because I align with everything that you just said. That's like my own philosophy, what I run and structure myself through. Crazy. I'm going to leave it there. The next chapter is the serpent power. Can't wait to dig into that. Their work is just mind-blowing. It's epic. And again, even though I butcher Blavatsky, they get a lot of their thought processes through her. And now I'm also discovering they're also getting influenced also by Manly P. Hall. And I think they were around in the same era of time frame. Because again, this was written in the 1920s, between 1920 and 1950. But their earlier works are in the 1800s. 1915. I have to look at the thing again. But I mean, their work, they have a ton of books. A ton of books, and I read a bunch of them already on this channel. I mean, there's no word to describe the insanity that they bring and how this insanity is now applying to us. We're all ascending. We're all starting to understand and remember our past incarnations to learn what we did wrong and why the lessons we have now are coming to a head and why we are transcending a lot of these concepts of things that no longer serve us. We don't have to repeat a cycle because we're cognizing, oh shit, I did this already. Why am I doing it again? Stop. And then you move forward with learning already a lesson that you probably learned in another lifetime. So things are now catching up with us to the extent where this book makes a shit ton of sense. If you're somebody who does read the Bible, take their perception. It is fantastic. And I have never read the Bible. I've read parts and pieces of it. I'm spiritual. Don't need a Bible. But it's very interesting to see their perception and the bringing in everything else, the layers. The Manly P. Hall book I'm reading also is talking about the same layers of astral, etherical, and mind. There's something to it. And yeah, he's a Mason, was a Mason. Okay, whatever. They had knowledge. He's bringing forward to people. Take it. You might not like them, but if they're imparting their secrets, there's a reason why they're secret and hidden. So please don't forget to hit that like, share, and subscribe. This work is ridiculously important for a lot of people to hear. Please read the book. It's free. There's a PDF. You can get this online on Amazon, I think. There's plenty of places to get these books. I have 2 of them. Some of them are very hard to find, but they're free. The PDFs are there. Read them. Their work is genius. And it's all speaking about now. Not when they wrote this. Their time, they're like the spiritualism, the paranormal stuff was outrageous in that time frame. People doing seances and all that cool stuff. Okay, but they're writing it during that time frame. So the spiritual upness, the ascension of consciousness was starting there. And here we are, decades later, reading this work and going, holy shit, this applies to now. We need to share this. We need to thumbs up it. We need to spread it so that other people can hear it and other people can get illumined. Other people can understand. It's very important to know the demons that are within you and what you need to fight. There is a war going on upstairs. Our higher selves are fighting it. You have to start recognizing everything as an initiation, as a test, as an experience that we need to have soul growth. Yes, it's hard. I'm not gonna lie. This material world is horrific. But you have to make the best out of your situation. If anybody, I have done that. And I'm still in a lot of suffering and a lot of hellstrom. The maelstrom is swirling. The insanity around me is going bananas. And yes, I have my bug zapper on. Sending each and every one of you protection, light, love, and shielding. Please have a great, wonderful rest of your week. Until the next one, guys, please be safe, be seen, and I'll see you on the next one.